The photograph sits on the kitchen table in Wrocław. It shows a street, or what used to be a street. In the photograph, it is rubble, an unbroken line of destruction stretching to the horizon, interrupted only by the occasional wall, still standing at an angle that suggests it has not yet decided whether to fall. The year written in pencil on the back is 1945. The city in the photograph is unrecognizable. Marek Kowalski is 67. He was not alive in 1945, but his father was. And his father told him the story enough times that it lives in Marek's memory with the texture of something experienced rather than inherited. The family came to Wrocław, then called Breslau, a German city until the borders moved, and the populations moved, and the names moved with them. In 1946, as part of the vast westward displacement of peoples that remade Central Europe after the war. They arrived to find a city that was 80% destroyed. They stayed anyway. There was nowhere else to go. My father said the first winter they burned furniture to stay warm, Marek says. Whatever they found in the rubble, books, floorboards, anything. He picks up the photograph and holds it next to the kitchen window. Outside through the glass, Wrocław in 2025 is something else entirely.
Let's hope it's not.
The market square, the Rynek, one of the largest medieval market squares in Europe, painstakingly rebuilt stone by stone over decades, is full of people on a Tuesday morning. Cafes, trams, tourists, a startup hub in a converted 19th century building where software engineers are working on products that will be used in 40 countries. A logistics center on the edge of the city that processes goods moving between Berlin and Warsaw and Kiev. A new concert hall that cost 200 million zloty and was funded partly by the EU and partly by a city that has decided, with some urgency, that it deserves beautiful things. My father would not recognize it, Marek says. He puts the photograph down. Neither would I, sometimes, and I watched it happen. This is a film about what happened, about how a country that spent the 20th century being invaded, occupied, partitioned, liberated, occupied again, and then frozen inside a system designed to prevent it from becoming what it was capable of becoming. How that country, in the 35 years since the wall came down and the system dissolved, became the fastest growing large economy in Europe and one of the most remarkable development stories in modern economic history. It is a story about memory and momentum, about a people who learned across centuries of catastrophe that nothing is permanent, including ruin, and about what happens when that knowledge meets an open market and a generation with nothing to lose and everything to prove. To understand what Poland has achieved, you have to understand what Poland was working against, not just economically, historically. Poland is a country whose borders have moved more dramatically than almost any other in Europe, absorbed by empires, erased from maps entirely for 123 years between 1795 and 1918, reconstituted, invaded from both sides simultaneously in 1939, liberated into a different occupation, and finally, in 1989, given something it had not possessed in any stable form for most of modern history, the freedom to decide its own direction. That history does something to a people. It creates, alongside the obvious trauma, a particular kind of resilience. Not optimism exactly, which would be too naive for people who have seen what Poles have seen, but something more practical. A refusal to treat the present situation as permanent. An understanding, bone deep and culturally transmitted, that circumstances change, that systems fall, that the map you are looking at today is not necessarily the map you will be looking at in 20 years. Jakoś to będzie, it will somehow work out, is a Polish phrase that sounds, in translation, like passive resignation, but is in practice something more active. It is the philosophy of a people who have learned that surviving requires improvisation.
Thank you so much.
That improvisation requires ingenuity, and that ingenuity, applied consistently over time, can transform ruins into something worth inhabiting. Poland in 1989 was not ruins, exactly, but it was close. The communist economy had left it with GDP per capita roughly 1/3 of the Western European average. A currency so devalued it was essentially fictional. Shelves in shops that were empty in ways that younger Europeans cannot now imagine. And an institutional infrastructure built to serve a system that had just collapsed. The joke that circulated in Warsaw in the early 1990s was that Poland had successfully achieved the transition from communism to pre-communism. What happened next was not obvious, and it was not inevitable. Poland chose, under the guidance of economists like Leszek Balcerowicz, whose shock therapy program was radical enough to be genuinely shocking, to move fast, to liberalize prices, open the market, allow creative destruction to happen at a speed that was painful in the short term and transformative in the medium term. Other countries in the region moved more cautiously. Poland moved quickly, absorbed the pain, and on the other side of the pain discovered that its economy was growing. It has not stopped since. From 1990 to 2024, across financial crises, the 2008 global recession, the pandemic, the war on its eastern border, Poland's economy has grown every single year except one. It is the only EU member state to have avoided recession in 2009. Its GDP per capita, measured in purchasing power, has gone from roughly 30% of the EU average at the start of the transition to approximately 80% today. In absolute terms, the Polish economy has roughly doubled in size since EU accession in 2004 alone. Marek watched all of this from Wrocław. He started a small manufacturing business in 1994. He failed. He started again in 1997.
Otherwise, the pressure won't.
He failed again, differently. He started a third time in 2001, building components for the automotive supply chain that was beginning to extend eastward from Germany. That one worked.
These pallets sorted by
The first two times I was learning, he says. The third time I knew what I was doing. Poland was learning at the same time. We were all learning at the same time. Poland's growth story is sometimes told as if it were simple, as if opening a market and joining the EU automatically produces this kind of result. It does not. The evidence of other transition economies, many of which followed similar paths with significantly different outcomes, makes that clear. What Poland did was harder and more specific than the simple version suggests. It ran 4 engines simultaneously, and it kept them running. The first engine was location, turned into logistics. Poland sits between Germany, the largest economy in Europe, and Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia to the east. For most of history, this position was a vulnerability. The flat North European plain that runs through Poland is an invasion corridor, as Poles know better than anyone. But in a peaceful, integrated Europe, the same geography became something else, a distribution hub. When European supply chains began extending eastward in the 1990s and 2000s, Poland was the first stop. German manufacturers needed cheaper labor that was still close, still educated, still embedded in European regulatory and legal systems. Poland offered all of this. Factories came, automotive, electronics, aerospace components, household goods. Infrastructure followed. Motorways that did not exist in 1990 were built across the country, funded partly by EU cohesion funds and partly by the Polish state's deliberate prioritization of connectivity over consumption. Today, Poland is one of Europe's most important logistics corridors. The country handles a growing share of the goods moving between Western Europe and the rest of the continent. Warsaw Chopin and the new central communication port, a massive new airport and rail hub under construction south of Warsaw, designed to handle 45 million passengers per year and position Poland as the transit point for Europe-Asia connectivity, represent a bet that the logistics story is not finished, but is entering a new and larger phase. The second engine was Europe, and Poland used it more intelligently than most. Poland received approximately 160 billion euros in EU structural and cohesion funds between 2004 and 2020, one of the largest per capita transfers in the history of European integration. This money was not simply absorbed and spent. It was, by the standards of EU fund utilization, deployed with unusual effectiveness in roads, in universities, in broadband infrastructure, in research institutions, in urban regeneration projects like the one that transformed Wrocław's post-industrial riverfront into an innovation district. The roads in particular changed Poland in ways that compound over time. A country that could not move goods efficiently between its cities in 1990 now has a motorway network connecting Warsaw to Krakow, Wrocław, Poznan, Gdansk, and the German border. This is not romantic. It is not a story about culture or identity, but it is, in the mundane and essential way that infrastructure always is, the physical foundation of economic activity. You cannot build a supply chain without roads. Poland built the roads. The third engine was people, specifically what Poland did with its human capital. Poland has one of the highest rates of university education in Europe. Nearly 60% of young Poles hold tertiary degrees, a figure that reflects both a cultural premium placed on education across all social classes, a legacy of the communist period when higher education was genuinely universal, and a rational response to the signals that the post-1989 economy sent about what skills it would reward. The result is a workforce that is unusually well-educated relative to its wage level. A software engineer in Warsaw or Krakow or Wrocław is educated to the same standard as one in Munich or Amsterdam, earns significantly less, though the gap is narrowing, and is embedded in a time zone, cultural frame, and institutional context that makes collaboration with Western European companies natural and efficient. Poland's technology sector, the companies that did not exist 20 years ago and now employ hundreds of thousands of people building products used globally, is built on this human capital surplus. CD Projekt Red, which produced the Witcher series and became one of the most valued gaming companies in the world, is Polish. Allegro, the e-commerce platform, is Polish. A growing cluster of fintech, cybersecurity, and enterprise software companies are choosing Krakow and Warsaw and Wrocław as their headquarters, not because Poland is cheap, but because the talent is here, and the talent is excellent. The fourth engine was something harder to quantify: hunger. This is not a comfortable word in economics, but it is the right word for what you observe when you talk to Polish entrepreneurs and engineers and managers of a certain generation, people who grew up with the memory of scarcity, who watched their parents navigate a system designed to suppress initiative, and who experienced the opening of 1989 not as a political event, but as a personal one, as the moment when effort and intelligence and ambition were suddenly allowed to produce results. Marek Kowalski is part of this generation. So are the founders of the technology companies. So are the farmers who rebuilt Polish agriculture in a single generation, turning a sector that was economically medieval in 1990 into the EU's largest agricultural exporter by value. So are the architects who rebuilt Wrocław's old town, not as a museum piece, but as a living city, and the engineers who built the motorways, and the entrepreneurs who built the logistics companies, and the teachers who built the schools that produced the engineers. Hunger, in this sense, is not desperation. It is the opposite of complacency. It is the energy that a society generates when it has been told for too long that ambition is suspect, and then suddenly discovers that it is not. Poland is not finished. Poland, in a very real sense, has barely started. The economic trajectory, if the institutions hold, if the European relationship remains functional, if the geopolitical environment does not deteriorate beyond what Poland's formidable defense posture can manage, points towards something genuinely significant. The IMF and World Bank projections, The European Commission assessments, the private investment flows that have accelerated rather than slowed since the war began on Poland's eastern border, all of them suggest a country that is not peaking, but compounding. A country whose infrastructure investments are beginning to pay the returns that infrastructure investments take 15 years to generate. A country whose technology sector is at the beginning of a curve, not the middle of one. The central communication port, the vast new transport hub under construction near Warsaw, is perhaps the clearest physical expression of Polish ambition in the current moment. It is expensive, complicated, debated, and possibly slightly too large for what Poland needs in the immediate term. It is also exactly the kind of bet that countries make when they are thinking in decades rather than electoral cycles. It is the motorway program of the 2030s. Warsaw is changing in ways that are visible to anyone who knew it 10 years ago. Not just richer, different in kind. The startup ecosystem that barely existed in 2010 is now producing companies that attract international venture capital. The restaurant culture, the cultural institutions, the design scene, the architecture, all of it signals a city that has decided it is not aspiring to be something, but already is something, and is now working out what comes next. In Krakow, Wrocław, Gdansk, Poznan, the cities that the motorway network connected and the EU funds rebuilt, and the human capital exodus partially reversed, the same transition is visible. Poland is becoming, unevenly and with considerable noise and political turbulence, a country that produces things at the frontier rather than one step behind it. And in the village outside Wrocław, where Marek Kowalski's father arrived in 1946 with nothing, his grandson, Marek's son's son, 8 years old, born into a Poland that has never known anything but growth, is growing up with assumptions about what is normal that would have been incomprehensible to any Polish child of the previous century. Normal electricity, normal supermarkets, normal schools, normal roads, a passport that opens most of the world, a currency that works, a country that for the first time in a very long time is not waiting for the next catastrophe, but building toward the next decade. On a Tuesday morning in March, Marek Kowalski drives across Wrocław. He passes the market square. He passes the technology hub in the converted 19th century building. He passes a construction site, there are always construction sites in Wrocław, where a new apartment block is going up on land that was empty for 30 years because no one could agree on its legal status, a legacy of the border changes and the population transfers and the ownership questions that the communist period resolved by ignoring. He stops at a red light. On the pavement next to him, two young women are talking, one in Polish, one in Ukrainian, switching between languages mid-sentence in the way that people do when languages are close enough that the distinction starts to feel arbitrary. He watches them for a moment. My father used to say, Marek tells me later, that Poland's problem was always that it was interesting to its neighbors. Too interesting. Everyone always wanted a piece of it. He pauses. Now I think, maybe that was also the point. Maybe being interesting, being worth wanting, is what kept us going, even when it hurt, even when it cost everything. The light changes. He drives on. Behind him, Wrocław continues to build itself, stone by stone,